The room is already quiet. A soft breath presses at the window, and somewhere nearby a telescope relay ticks. One small click, then a longer hush. I'm here beside you, voice low, keeping pace with your breathing, as night finds its slow rhythm. Tonight we'll keep company with an interstellar visitor people are calling Atlas, and we'll do it without hurry. I'll guide your gaze, name the calm facts, and let long silences hold the rest. If you'd like, set your phone to Do Not Disturb, slip on headphones, and keep the volume just below thought. You can add this to your nightly playlist, so the same steady tone greets you again when sleep asks for familiar steps. Our path is simple. First, a gentle look, then how watchers listen, and finally, who helps the world speak carefully, if speaking is ever needed. No countdowns, no chase, only an easy drift through what's known, what's likely, and what can wait. If you drift off halfway, that's perfect. I'll keep the light trimmed and the tempo even so nothing startles the edges of rest. We'll let curiosity be soft and certainty take its time. Breathe in slowly, let the shoulders settle. The clicks thin, like pebbles dropped in a far pool, and the air has that cool night scent that remembers distant snow. If a question rises, let it pass like a faint cloud across the lens. There will be time later for answers, and kindness for the parts that stay unknown. The dark blue at the window lightens toward a quiet green, then a pale silver, colours easing one into the next until they blur, and we step together into the watch. Start with the eye. Let it rest on the faint wash at the edge of the window, where city glow thins and starlight has room to collect. There, against a patient dark, I trace a dim smear that telescopes sharpen into a small moving halo. People are calling it Atlas. I say the name softly, so it lands like a dot of light, and not a headline. It is an interstellar visitor, third of its kind seen from here, and tonight we treat it as a quiet guest, not a siren. I guide your gaze the way I guide my own, left of the familiar constellation, a finger width above the low silver star that sets early this season. The halo is modest, a whisper of dust and gas around something darker. Interstellar means it does not belong to our sun's family. Its path is a hyperbolic curve, the signature of coming from elsewhere and going on beyond. You don't need the numbers right now. The shape tells the story. A visitor that won't stay. A bright note that fades with distance. We've seen two before. One with a name that sounded like a vowel from the deep past, and a second that looked more like a classic comet. This one arrives in a better era for watching. Instruments learn, archives grow, and we have steadier hands at the controls. I like that thought. It takes pride and worry out of the picture and replaces both with care. Tonight, that's our pace. Careful, not breathless. Let the lid of each eye grow heavier by a fraction as we notice what is steady. The slow drift relative to field stars, the way the coma holds its shape, the way background galaxies remain pinned. The sky is full of motion that looks like stillness from a distance. Atlas will swing closer to the sun than Mars ever does, and then turn outward again. The wider story is a loop of light, traced once and never repeated. The key is that it is not on a path that crosses Earth in any risky way. No threat is a stable phrase here, not a reassurance trick. It simply describes geometry. To settle the mind, I like 3 handholds. First, a date. Atlas was noticed by a survey that scans the sky for moving points early in July, a good season for clear southern nights. Second, a path. its eccentricity is greater than 1, the quiet mathematical way of saying it will not be captured by the sun. Third, a window. Around late October, it passes nearest to the sun. That is when telescopes can best examine the gases it sheds and the dust it carries. 3 simple lights on a dim staircase, enough to walk by. Watch how the halo changes with a blink. In one moment, the coma seems slightly brighter to one side. In the next, the impression relaxes, as if your eyes have learned what to ignore. The mind loves patterns, and patterns love to trick the mind, which is why we stack observations from different nights, different instruments, different eyes, until the false curves even out and the real curve remains. That is how the sky teaches us to be unhurried. It transmits in long sentences, and the meaning arrives only when you sit still long enough to hear the commas. Lean closer, then lean back. Either way, the same soft green trace returns, a faint suggestion near the edge of vision that feels cooler than surrounding starlight, like a snow-lit road at midnight that reveals itself only when you stop trying to look directly at it and let your gaze loosen, because the outer parts of the eye have their own quiet way of registering the world, and sometimes that is where the honest signal lives. For faint things, trust the periphery. Interstellar is not a synonym for strange. It is a context word. Different nursery cloud, different recipe for ice and stone. The halo may lean toward one chemistry or another. That is for spectrographs to whisper about. For us, resting here, the task is gentler. To note that it is new to our skies, but old in its own story, and that our best posture is attentive ease. If your thoughts wander, let them drift no farther than the field stars. They will find their way back when the tiny motion of the halo reminds them there is a slow narrative to follow. If you wanted a feeling to keep, let it be this: a patient curve written across the dark, not aimed at us, not staged for drama, simply passing through the light that happens to be ours. I find that comforting. It means the universe doesn't gather itself to unsettle us. It carries on, and we may watch without assigning it a role. The quiet work tonight is to breathe with that rhythm, to let the steady tick of the relay become the metronome for thought, and to borrow the sky's unargumentative voice. So we return to the faint wash, and we practice seeing small things, a glow no brighter than the suggestion of frost along a path. The coma offers a hint of structure, then erases it. Stars hold their positions, as if pinned by invisible filaments. We move our gaze slightly, and the halo persists. When you close your eyes, you may find an after image like pale watercolor at the edge of an inner field. That, too, is part of the watch. The eye keeps a memory of dimness that helped it relax. We'll carry these handholds with us as the night turns its slow wheel, the names spoken softly, the path described by shape, and the window of study that opens and closes without urgency. If sleep arrives before any of that resolves into something more, that is still a complete story. The sky is not a test you must pass. It is a lantern you can set lower or higher until the room feels kind. The green hint at the window thins toward blue, and then to a gentle silver that smooths the scene into an easy plane. The color lets go of itself, and we let go with it, drifting without strain into the next quiet look. The spectrograph sets the pace tonight. A cooling fan hums, a status LED blinks in a slow pair, on, off. A faint relay ticks as the shutter moves, and we let our voices ride the instrument's rhythm. It threads the minutes into something even, something you can rest on. On this table of light and time, the old rule sits like a neatly folded cloth. No reply shall be sent until appropriate international consultations. The sentence has lived in astronomy rooms for decades, stitched into the margin of our work. It was written when I was young in the field, and it still lies where we can reach it with a calm hand. If you press your palm to the bench, you can almost feel the seam run beneath it. The quiet thread that keeps the fabric from fraying when excitement tugs at the edges. The sensor chirps. I note the mark and keep my tone low. This was never a gag order, never a sudden patch slapped over a tear. It came with the first shared guidance on how to behave after detection, and it travelled forward through later streamlining without changing its weave. The point is coordination, not control. The point is to avoid snags, false alarms, hurried claims, tangled conclusions. We know how easily a single bright stitch can pull a pattern out of shape. You might ask, who holds the other end of the thread when something more than dust and light appears? It runs through scientific hands first, then toward the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space at the United Nations, and sideways into the careful domain of the International Telecommunication Union, when radios would speak or listen. Those bodies don't own the cloth. They help keep the selvage straight so a message, if one is ever warranted, doesn't ravel as it leaves us. Slow work, pin, measure, breathe, then cut. The spectrograph whispers again. I watch the trace creep and think of prior moments when the world nearly leapt. A long time ago, a narrowband shout on a summer evening looked like a pulled gold thread, too regular to be wind or rock. Years later, a star far away dimmed and brightened in odd measures, and headlines wanted looms and megastructures. We waited. We added layers. The signal did not return in a way that held. The dimming found its explanation in finer dust and better models. The cloth lay flat again. I find that memory helpful, not to dampen wonder, but to remind us that patience is part of craft. If you run your finger along this rule, you feel texture. First, verify with more than one loom, more than one telescope, more than one team. Second, store the pattern where many hands can examine the weave, not locked in a chest that breeds rumour. Third, bring the people who understand spectrum, law, language, and risk into the same room so no one tugs alone and warps the fabric. That is all the clause means. It's less dramatic than it sounds, the way seam allowances are less dramatic than gowns, yet just as necessary. I rest my elbows on the bench and let the relays tick, become your metronome. The thread runs on through earlier years when the guidance was fewer pages and more principle than procedure, and then to the present draft work that widens definitions without changing the heart of them. In every version, the same idea returns, that the first voice shouldn't leap ahead of the many, that a single bright spool shouldn't dominate the pattern when a whole room of weavers can keep the line truer if they move together, even if that togetherness takes a little more time than our nerves would prefer. The rule protects the cloth, and the cloth protects us. Notice how the room's sounds settle, air through vent baffles, the quiet cable sway as the dome breathes. These are the small regularities that let us listen longer. The absence of hurry is not dismissal. It's the kind of attention a tailor gives to seams that will never be seen, because how a garment feels depends on what you can't see. Governance feels like that when it works. You sleep easier not because someone scolded the night into silence, but because the hems are smooth and the lining doesn't scratch. The spectrograph's response curve brightens and dims, and with each rise I think again about words and how they should be laid. We do not speak for the species from a single desk. We don't thread a message through with only our own initials at the corner. If one day we need to answer, the letter will carry many signatures: scientists, ethicists, diplomats, radio managers, so that no strand bears more tension than it should. That is not bureaucracy as barrier, it is structure as support, like interfacing. At a jacket's front, it lets it hang well rather than collapse into creases. Let your shoulders lower here. The rule is older than tonight's visitor and not aimed at it. It is a standing habit, a seam pressed in with care long before this object curved through our light. We are allowed to be curious, allowed to gather, allowed to share the pattern as it emerges. The one thing we are asked to pause before doing is answering in haste. Between the last measured stitch and the first public word lies a breath. We take it together. The fan eases for a moment, as if to listen to itself. The relay settles into its cadence once more. I slide the logbook a little to the right and draw a short line under the last entry, remembering how many such lines connect, year after year, to make a record that can be trusted. That is our contribution to the cloth. Even tension, straight grain, no drama cut on the bias. When the time comes to fold the night back into its drawer, we leave the edge unfrayed. A light clicks. Once. What changed, really? A small question to set us walking. The answer is gentler than rumour. A draft was written in 2025 that widens our map without changing the road's direction. We'll follow it like travellers with lanterns, count in mile markers of care. First marker. Is there a new document? Yes, a progress draft by familiar hands, the sort of paper that invites comment and shows its work. It gathers what watchers have learned since radio was the only lane and lays out how to treat a candidate with patience and order. Draft means not binding law. It means a path chalked on the ground, so the group can test the turns before paving anything. Second marker. What does it widen? Detection no longer wears only headphones. The draft names lasers that blink faster than a heartbeat, infrared glows that might betray waste heat, curious polarization shifts, and other signatures a single ear would miss. To hold each clue, it asks for archiving of raw and processed data, for clocks to be checked, and for independent eyes to repeat the measure. The walk is deliberate, steps match, shoes quiet on the path, a low turn in the road. Why list lasers at all? Because some colleagues have long searched for bright, nanosecond flashes near known stars, on the chance another mind chose light over radio to call across the dark. Those searches are careful, and so is the draft in how it frames them. A pulse alone is not an arrival. It is a reason to circle back, to return at another hour, to see if the light appears on schedule or only in our hopes. Next bend. Why count warmth? A civilization that uses immense energy would spill heat into the night. Surveys in the infrared have looked for galaxies or stars with too much mid-infrared brightness, patterns that could hint at industry rather than dust. So far, those catalogues read like quiet roads after rain. Reflective, yes, but mostly natural. The draft keeps this lane open without promising. Surprises at every turn. a long straight. How does the draft treat the first whisper of a signal? Like a traveller checks their compass at a fork. It asks for more than one team, more than one instrument, and more than one night, because noise loves to masquerade as news. It asks us to store the journey so others can replay it, step for step. It asks us to keep the path clear of local interference, the way hikers keep switchbacks free of loose stones so the next boots don't slip. None of this is glamorous. All of it keeps ankles unbroken. We pass a marker that looks older than the rest, and I run a finger over its softened date. The sentence about consulting before replying has been on the trail since 1989, carved into the first set of principles many of us learned by heart. The draft does not plant a new post here. It brushes lichen off the old one and adds small arrows for modern crossings. Radio on this side, optics on that. Networked archives down the slope. A sign for communication engineers where the path meets the ridge. You might wonder if a draft like this binds the feet of every walker. It doesn't. It points and persuades. What gives it weight is adoption. How many observatories choose these waypoints? How many journals ask for the same maps? How many agencies agree that safe walking is shared walking? That's how a trail becomes the trail. Not with a fence, but with footfall after footfall, until the groove is the least tiring way forward. Pause here and listen to the air move through the pines of the dome. The sound is steady. That's the feeling of a good process. We can still turn around if the weather changes. We can still take a side path to check an odd glint through the trees. But the main road remains visible, even when fog drifts down. And that means fewer lost nights, fewer urgent rescues. Further along, the draft speaks softly about public notice. When a candidate holds up under repeat steps, data should not vanish into a backpack. It should be set out where other travellers can see the trail, including the stones we kicked and the puddles we avoided. Open work lets arguments be about rocks and bridges rather than rumours of dragons. It keeps the walk human-sized. There's a mile marker I like to tap as we pass. It reminds us that new instruments change the shape of the journey. A telescope with a colder mirror hears whispers that warmer mirrors miss. A spectrograph with finer teeth can comb details from what used to look like a smooth field. The draft makes room for these upgrades without pretending each upgrade is revelation. Tools improve, then patience does the rest. If the road splits, natural on one side, artificial on the other, the draft doesn't force us to choose at once. It suggests we camp for a night in the clearing, compare notes on the terrain, and send a few careful pairs to scout both directions before we commit the group. That is part of the mile markers of care. Rest stops, not roadblocks. The difference is how you feel inside your steps. One makes your shoulders drop. The other makes them rise. You and I keep walking. On the right, a small post with familiar initials points towards the room where spectrum managers meet when messages would ride radio bands. On the left, an arrow nods toward ethicists and linguists who consider not only what we might say, but what our saying would mean to the listeners and to ourselves. We don't need to enter those rooms tonight. It's enough to know they exist on the map, ready if the trail turns that way. A long sentence unspools like path beneath our feet, taking us past a stand of quiet instruments and a signboard with weather pinned to cork and a little brass box for comments from hikers who came before. And it says that the value of this draft is not in any single flourish of language, but in the way it keeps the journey legible for all of us, so that if a faint light appears between the trees or a rhythm in the wind repeats enough to catch the ear, we meet it together with our boots laced, our maps unfolded, and our pace unhurried. What changed, really? Less than you were told, and exactly enough. Quietly so. That is enough for tonight. 3 handrails, 3 steady tones to hold as we listen. First, a date you can place like a tuning note. Early July, the survey called Atlas noticed a moving point against the fixed choir of background stars, one of many sky checks it makes each night. Second, a path, not circular but open, the shape that says this traveller belongs to no orbit here. Third, a window, the stretch of weeks when sunlight and geometry bring the object into clearer pitch for the instruments that study it. With those tones in the ear, the rest of the score can be read without hurry. Handrail 1, date and origin of the notice. The Atlas network is arranged to hear faint footfalls, wide-field eyes sweeping for motion, then motion again, so that a thread of positions can be pulled tight into a track. On a July night, the software raised a calm flag, not an alarm, and a human looked where the code pointed. Additional images followed. Points were fitted. The staff lines of time and angle began to form a phrase that didn't match the quieter melodies of local comets and the usual near-Earth stones. Handrail 2, path and classification. The curve is hyperbolic, the way a tone that never resolves feels open-ended. Eccentricity greater than 1 is our way of saying unbound. Incoming from elsewhere, then gone again when the cadence completes. That is what Interstellar means in this context. Not menace, not mystery as a profession, but a clean geometry. The speed fits that picture, faster than an object long held by the sun's gravity, and the direction leans from a place our catalogues do not claim as home. It is enough to name, and then to let the name rest. Handrail 3, the window we watch. Perihelion falls in late October by current fits that close past by the sun that wakes a comet's surface if ices are near enough to answer the warmth. Around that time, the elongation on our sky often gives telescopes better angles. Spectrographs can begin to separate faint gases. Photometry can track changes with a steadier hand, and polarimetry can test how dust scatters light. In plain speech, the microphones can be moved closer to the stage without stepping on cables. It gives the band more presence, and our notebooks more signal. Between those tones is a phrase that listeners sometimes miss. No known threat is not a lullaby formula. It is an operational description. The minimum distance between this path and ours is comfortable. The uncertainty shrink wrap around that number has tightened as the track lengthened, the way a sustained note gets cleaner when the player holds it a bar longer. There are no bulletins asking for contingency rehearsals. The orchestra plays on. We check our part and keep the tempo calm. This is where the sound of the room matters. We run sequences, short exposures, longer ones, so the signal accumulates without saturating. We call other observatories because a melody is truer when more ears agree on the pitch. We ask those closer to dawn or dusk to catch the object at solar angles we can't reach tonight. Phase geometry is like room acoustics. Certain corners amplify, others swallow the line. When the window opens wide enough, the whole ensemble hears the same phrase, and that's when the score becomes easier to read. Think of the Sun object distance here as a range that overlaps, for a time, the belt, where Mars keeps its wandering. Not a crossing, not a braid, just a region where warmth and light make instruments hum. The word within has a narrow, technical sound. In practice, it means we can expect a little more activity than we saw far out, and we can ask better questions of the coma, the tail, and the grain sizes that reveal themselves when light is pushed through the dust like a bow across strings. What else lives under no threat? Node crossings matter. This path does not bring the object to Earth's orbital node with the timing that turns watches into warnings. Inclination, longitude of ascending node, argument of perihelion. Each parameter is a note in a chord that either resolves into caution or fades into ordinary watchfulness. Tonight, the chord is gentle. We log, we measure, we share. The discipline is in returning to the same bar at intervals, so small changes are heard in context, rather than guessed at between rehearsals. Midway through the session, let's rest our ears in a little hush. Then, take the line again, lower in volume. The tail, if it grows, will be a thin harmony under the main tone of the nucleus, its direction set by sunlight and solar wind more than by the object's own choice. Photometric scatter at low signal to noise can make it seem to waver bar to bar, but averages across runs pull a straighter staff. From the dots, patience is how noise yields. The handrails do not promise a fireworks coda. They keep the piece playable. Date anchors the start of the phrase. Path tells us which family of forms we're likely hearing. Window sets our schedule for louder versus softer cues. Around them, we place our quieter notes. Predicted magnitude curves with error bars, expected gas species near the sun, reasonable ranges for dust polarization angles, all the small marks that let many players stay together without looking for a conductor they don't need. In the second half of a long night, when the dome's breath evens and the logbook smells faintly of paper and dust, the comfort is in how these three tones continue to line up. First, the July downbeat that put the object on our page at all. Then the open curve that tells us the music will not loop back into a bound refrain. And finally, the late October swell that gives the microphones their best chance to collect a fuller tone, each of them arriving not as a thrill that sharpens the shoulders, but as a low ring that keeps time so evenly. You stop noticing time and simply hear the piece unfold, measure by patient measure, bar by kind bar. Take one more check of the numbers and mark them lightly. If you drift toward sleep here, the handrails will keep their place without you. That's what they are for. They won't bind you to the chair. They'll just be where you left them when your attention returns, humming like a distant transformer in a quiet town, reminding you that the line continues whether you listen or rest. The count's steady, and begin close to the surface, where light seems to hang in the air like breath on a cold morning. In the eyepiece, the glow is soft, and if you let your gaze loosen, you can almost feel texture, fines drifting outward, a slow unraveling that moves as quietly as low mist sliding off a hill before dawn. At this scale, every grain matters. Some are powder fine and ride sunlight easily. Some are heavier and resist the push, hovering near the path the object already walks. The whole scene is a weather of particles. When I hold the image in mind without squeezing it, the halo becomes a veil that breathes, now denser, now thin, its shape changing with angles, with light, with nothing more dramatic than the steady drift of time. Step back a little, and the veil begins to show structure. A classic tale points away from the sun, as if the warmth has brushed dust and gas into a single direction. Yet, there are nights when the picture plays tricks. A second plume seems to point the other way, toward the sun, like a finger drawing in dew on a window. That sunward feature is what astronomers call an anti-tail, and the word sounds defiant when it is only geometry in disguise. The effect begins with larger grains. They leave the nucleus more slowly and spread in a thin sheet that lies close to the orbital plane, as even as fog settling in a valley. Seen from the right angle, that sheet catches light and looks like a tail reaching sunward. Decades ago, a comet called Roland carried a striking anti-tail across the sky. Photographs show a bright wedge leaning against expectation while the ordinary tail streamed away. Nothing supernatural happened, only the careful mischief of perspective. The same way a road can seem to narrow into a point when the morning haze pulls distance into a single line. Another layer of subtlety comes from how scattered light is polarized. When sunlight touches tiny grains in a coma, it can leave the scene slightly ordered, like ripples running one way across a shallow flood. At very small sun-comet observer angles, many comets show what's called a negative polarization branch. The electric field of the scattered light aligns in a direction our instruments record as negative, relative to the scattering plane. It's a dry phrase for a delicate behavior, and it belongs to the physics of haze, not to rumor. As the phase angle widens, the curve crosses an inversion point, often somewhere around 20 degrees, and the polarization becomes positive, then tends toward a modest maximum closer to a right angle. That smooth S-shaped journey tells us about grain size, structure, and composition. Fluffy clusters versus compact bits, darker soot-rich particles versus clearer ices, mixtures that change how the light walks through them. Polarimetry is the art of reading a weather of dust, the way a careful hiker learns to read the thickness of fog by how far a fence post fades into it. Because the signals are faint, and the night air has moods of its own, we gather long runs. We let the numbers accumulate so the temporary swirls cancel and the steadier pattern remains. We call for confirmation from other sights, other instruments, other nights, because mirage is the favorite trick of thin things. A single exposure can whisper sunward, then the stack speaks in a rounder voice. Every time that happens, I feel the same small gratitude you feel when a path reappears after a patch of featureless white. Keep in mind how perception joins the play. When an anti-tail is faint, peripheral vision can decide what it wants to see. The brain loves straight lines. It learns the rules and invents order when the scene offers only hints. That is one reason we lean on instruments that don't dream, polarimeters and photometers that let the mist be mist until it shows a reliable edge. Your job, resting here, is easier. Let the picture form without force, and accept that some nights the air is too soft for decisions. If Atlas grows such a sunward sliver, we'll greet it like a familiar weather sign rather than an omen. Interstellar does not forbid the old tricks. Different ices and dust will still play with light, as mist does with a street lamp, glowing in sheets, pooling in hollows, thinning where a breeze has moved on. The interesting part is in the details, how quickly the feature strengthens or fades, how the curve of polarization shifts as the phase angle changes, how grain sizes sort themselves when warmth rises by small degrees across the weeks. Those are the ways a traveling haze tells you what it is made from. Let your attention drift a step wider again. The tale you expect and the anti-tale you sometimes see are not arguments. They are companions in a single scene. One is fast dust and gas riding pressure outward. The other is heavier material lingering in a thin plane that our angle turns into a narrow wedge. Both can come and go as quietly as fog banks rolling over a meadow, now making a tree look closer, now making it vanish. And in all of that, the nucleus keeps its pace unaltered by our interpretations. I like to think of polarimetry as the way we measure the hand of the mist on our cheek. We turn our face a little, feel the change, and write the angle down, repeating the motion until the pattern holds, because the truth of a faint thing often arrives not as a single decisive line, but as a contour traced and retraced until it persists against the tangle of noise. And that persistence, rather than any one dramatic moment, is what lets us speak softly, with some confidence about what the haze is doing, and why it chooses certain paths across the light. Across a long night, these subtleties keep us unhurried. If a wedge leans the wrong way, we check the geometry of our view. If the numbers hint at a deep negative branch, we check again at a slightly wider angle, then compare to the curve a dozen other comets have walked before. There is comfort in how often nature rhymes with itself. Even when a particular stanza is unusual, the poem remains one we've heard, with mist at its edges and a cadence that stays kind. For you, listening, this means you don't have to hold the scene tightly. Let it blur the way a window does when the morning fog thickens and everything beyond seems nearer, then farther, then near again. The halo is still the halo. The tail, when it grows, will still mean warmth touching old ices. The anti-tail, if it appears, will be a sheet in the plane, caught by our angle. We will name each gently, then set the names down where they don't disturb your rest. And when the session draws to a close, I step back from the eyepiece and look with the whole face, the way you look at weather rather than at a single droplet. A faint wedge, a regular tail, a halo that breathes between them. None of it insists, none of it shouts. The room is quiet, the dome is steady, and the faint halo we've carried through these minutes loosens like mist in a widening field as the night leans toward a softer grey. Follow one colour. A thin red line glows across the spectrograph's face, steady as a heartbeat seen through glass. I trace it with a fingertip held just above the panel, letting the hue be our guide through the ways we listen when we want to learn without leaping. Start with radio, where the cosmos hums between thunder and whisper. Searchers favour narrow-band tones, needles thinner than a piano string, because nature almost never stretches light so tightly on its own. Around the hydrogen line, near 1420 MHz, receivers sip the sky in slivers. If a tone holds, if it drifts just as the Earth's rotation says it should, we lean closer. If it fades with local tests, we back away. The red line stays patient while we move, now to light itself, used in pulses. Optical SETI looks for flashes so brief they live between heartbeats. Nanoseconds bright enough to outshine a star for a breath, then gone. Photomultipliers watch in coincidence so that one detector's dream is not mistaken for the sky's intent, and twin telescopes confirm each other so a distant satellite glint or a cosmic ray can't masquerade as a call. A pulse is not proof. A repetition with timing becomes interesting. A repetition seen by strangers becomes a candidate to keep. We follow the colour to heat. Waste heat searches ask a simple question. If a civilization gathers extraordinary energy, where does the surplus glow? All across the mid-infrared, surveys comb for sources brighter than dust and star formation alone would suggest. Catalogues come back with quiet news, no grand excess across whole galaxies, no bright menagerie of engineered swarms. Natural warmth fills the lists, and the red line does what good guides do. It points, but it does not promise. Between these lanes sits polarization and spectrum, the way light twists or splits when it meets dust or gas or glass. We read the angles, we sift the lines, and we name molecules by their fingerprints. Each technique alone can tease. Together, they can persuade. That is the toolkit. Radios for tones, optics for flashes, infrared for warmth, spectra for chemistry, polarization for the dance steps light remembers as it leaves. But the tools are only half the craft. The other half is how we keep the notes. The standing guidance is plain. Store raw and process data so others can replay our listen. Guard the frequency bands that carry candidates. Check clocks with clocks. Invite independent teams to press on the same points until a pattern holds or collapses. A finding that cannot be replayed is a mood, not a measurement. The red line waits for consensus before it lets us claim a tune. The opposite of consensus is interference. Airplanes whisper in radio, satellites flash at odd angles, ground electronics shed stray rhythms. So we test the site by turning off the nearby, one rack, then another, until the local glow goes dark. We point away and back. We schedule the object at a new hour. We let a partner observatory try while we sleep. Signals that survive these small trials grow calmer. Signals that vanish were ours all along. History sits on the shelf like a careful warning. A narrowband burst in the 70s thrilled a handful of headphones, then never returned. Star's light curve wobbled a decade ago, and the world rushed to name grand structures. Later, dust and data work braided the wobbles into a natural story. These are not scoldings. They are reminders that the sky sometimes offers a riddle with a common answer, and that our ears are eager, which is fine as long as our notebooks are steadier than our hunches. How would we listen to our traveller then? We park a radio dish near the object's track and watch for slender drifting tones that repeat with the right celestial rhythm. We set optical detectors to scan for sub-microsecond flashes from the same coordinates, clocked by stars, double-checked by a far station. We let infrared watchers monitor for odd warmth that grows and shrinks against natural curves. If the object brightens in gases, we spread spectra like threads and look for patterns that chemistry can own. And we do these things in days, then in weeks, because the night's patience often pays what impatience spends. None of this asks you to hold your breath. The discipline is the shape of a night. Set the instruments, write the times, compare, repeat. A candidate that crosses wavelengths, instruments, and teams begins to look like a thing in the world rather than a trick of our rooms. And a candidate that crosses nights begins to look like a thing in time. The thin red line still hums on the panel as we pass from one check to the next, and in that steadiness is comfort. We also mind how we speak. Claims that fit in small words are easier to test. Tone, pulse, warmth, line, angle. We say what we saw, how we saw it, who else looked. We add the oddities we couldn't iron flat. We hold back the adjectives that seem to do our thinking for us. And then we wait, because waiting allows other minds and other senses to tug at the thread from their direction until the picture aligns, or fades. Here is the long view, folded into one breath of light. Across frequencies and instruments and calendars, we follow a single hue, from whisper to flash to glow to line, refusing the pull of any one lane long enough to let multiple lanes agree. Because agreement, the same pattern landing in independent rooms under independent clocks, turns a night of impressions into a morning of evidence. And that is how we keep wonder from outrunning truth, while we keep truth warm enough to welcome wonder when it finally arrives. If Atlas offers only quiet, the toolkit still sings. It teaches us how to listen without strain. If something sharpens within that quiet, the same tools shape our reply or our decision not to speak at all, with care that feels almost like calm. I look again at the panel and see our colour where we left it, unhurried and exact. You can rest your eyes there for a moment if you like. The line is thin and red, and it holds. If a signal holds its shape after the second and third look, then the next stitch is consultation. If a candidate survives new instruments and new nights, then we set the cloth on the bigger table and invite more hands to keep the hem straight. If nothing endures, then we fold the swatch back into the drawer and rest the fabric without fuss. That is the mood of this room when governance begins. Quiet conditionals, not alarms. I think of the process as the stitched hem that keeps wonder from fraying. A seam is small, almost invisible when done well, and it exists so the larger garment can hang without pulling. Detection is the cut, verification is the pinning, consultation is the seam. We touch each step lightly, but in order, because order is how cloth keeps its strength. First, within the sciences, the circle widens. A post-detection working group assembles to review the weave. Astronomers, alongside archivists, statisticians, linguists, and people who handle public communication with a gentle hand. Findings are replicated, raw data is archived, and the thread that runs through the notes is the same word repeated in different fonts, reproducible. That word is the bias tape along the edge. It keeps the line from curling when attention heats it. Then we lift our eyes to the forum designed for spacefaring neighbours. At the United Nations, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space listens for matters that cross borders by their nature. Space law and policy are their fabric, and consensus is the stitch they prefer. Consensus is slow for the same reason hand-stitching is slow. It trades speed for control. It distributes tension so no one place puckers. Delegations confer, secretariats draft, translators make sure a sentence means the same thing in every tongue. The hem grows in even little bites. On a side table sits a spool marked radio. That belongs to the International Telecommunication Union, where frequencies are divided and guarded so that one singer doesn't drown out a chorus. If a reply were ever contemplated, or if a detection occupied bands where terrestrial services live, the radio regulations would tell us which threads can be pulled and which must not, and how to protect a narrow strand from being snagged by local noise. The point is not permission so much as prevention. You keep the fabric from tearing before you show it to the room. Between these bodies flow the quieter tools that let the seam lie flat. Meeting of experts' notices, shared repositories, timestamps aligned to trusted clocks, press language shaped to say what is known and to leave the rest unclaimed. Even the pauses help. A measured breath between clauses can keep a paragraph from distorting under the pull of expectation. In that breath, the tone settles. You may wonder what happens if a hand tugs too hard, if a group wants to stitch ahead of the pattern. In practice, the fabric itself resists. Independent observatories publish their own swatches. Journals ask for the same threads and stitches. Spectrum managers insist that transmitters sing where the chart allows. Outliers can try to cut on the bias, but the community's habit is to check the grain and set the shears back down when the line isn't true. Why all this care? Because the garment we're making fits everyone. A message sent in haste would drape over every shoulder, and a poorly placed seam would scratch at every collarbone. When the stake is collective identity, what we say as we, or whether we say anything at all, then the hem must be strong enough to be worn by nations that disagree about many other things. That strength comes from small stitches taken close together, not from a single long sweep meant to impress. The rhythm has a geography as well as a method. Draft language may move across desks in Vienna and Geneva, while, at the same time, midnight labs in Mauna Kea or La Silla keep measuring, and observatories in the Karoo or the Canary Islands repeat the listening, and each place enters its lines in a public ledger, so that progress is a weave made from law and light at once, not a decree laid over science, but a lining that lets science hang wider without warping when the world turns its attention toward it. We do not pretend the hem can be sewn overnight, nor do we leave it loose. The habit is to baste first, temporary stitches that hold position while everyone checks the fit. Then permanent seams when the fit proves comfortable after a walk around the room. A preliminary advisory here, a frequency coordination there, a template for data release elsewhere, each action small. Together, they keep the edge from ruffling. Back in the dome, none of this feels grand. It feels like taking in a seam, because the shoulder sat wrong. It feels like pressing a fold so the lining doesn't catch. I read a sentence about appropriate consultations. Set the iron of time on it and let the fabric cool before we try it on again. We ask whether the stitch count is even. We check whether the selvage has wandered. We lift the cloth to the light and look for thin places that might tear when worn. If the night ever brings us to a letter from Earth, it will not be drafted on a whim. It will be cut from cloth that held together under handling. The thread will be strong enough to pass from scientist to ambassador without breaking. The words will be hemmed so they don't unravel when they travel. Clear enough to mean the same thing after orbit and echo. Spare enough to avoid snagging on our own fears. That is what this stitched hem is for. Not to bind speech, but to let it hang well when many must wear it. Let the room go even quieter for a breath. Then take the sound of air as reassurance. The rule about waiting to reply has lived in the lining for a long time. The newer draft work only strengthens the seam where modern fabrics pull. If a detection fades, we unpick nothing more than a few basting threads. If it holds, we sew more firmly, share the pattern, and fit the garment in good light. If the hemming keeps us from tripping on our own cuffs, is that not a kindness worth taking? Dear listener, this part is for you. You don't need a dome or a big dish to belong on the path we're walking tonight. You need curiosity, a gentle hand with facts, and the habit of leaving good cairns for those who come after you. You can join the trail in quiet ways. People have lent spare computing time to sift radio data, turning many small processors into one long stride across the sky. Others have sorted starlight by eye in citizen projects, marking dips and blinks that trained algorithms miss, and sometimes those marks become new worlds on the map. The point isn't speed, it's presence. A steady step, then another. When we say open sky and open data, we mean that the map is shared. Catalogues are posted where anyone can walk the grid lines. Light curves and spectra arrive with timestamps and instrument notes, like mile markers painted on rocks. The current guidance encourages that sharing and asks observers to archive their raw steps as well as their cleaned ones, so later walkers can replay the route, check the footing, and see where a boot slipped or a cloud crossed the sun. You've seen how this helps. A few years ago, a team announced a trace of a gas high in a neighbouring planet's clouds. Exciting, because on Earth, that gas often hints at life. Then came the long walk. Other groups retraced the path with their own processing choices and instruments. Some found the trail fading, some found other, plainer routes through the same landscape. It wasn't drama, it was navigation, backtracking, comparing compass headings, making sure we weren't following a shadow. Online, the trail can seem noisy. A new claim is a bright sign at a fork, and it's tempting to sprint after it. That's when the norms become handrails. Write what you saw and how you saw it. Name your instrument, your settings, your time. Share the unpolished files alongside the cleaned ones. Avoid turning a single footprint into a destination. If someone asks for directions, offer the map, not a promise. This makes the path safer for everyone. When many walkers bring their notes to the same clearing, the noise of personal steps fades and the shared features remain. This bend in the river, that cluster of faint trees, the ridge where the view opens. A claim that survives multiple paths is stronger than a claim that survives only a single sprint. And a claim that grows through weeks of walking is richer than one that glitters for an hour and is gone. Your role can be as simple as careful witness. If you post a chart, add the mile markers, time, exposure, filter, phase angle, any clouds in the way. If you cite someone else's chart, carry their markers intact. When you're unsure, say so plainly. Uncertainty isn't a flaw, it's the contour lines on the map. They tell others where the slope begins and where it eases, and they keep ankles from turning when the ground looks flatter than it is. There's a kindness in this too. People get tired on long ascents. A gentle tone keeps the group together. You can encourage a good question without crowning it as discovery. You can point out a loose stone without accusing the person who stepped on it of clumsiness. The trail will still be there tomorrow, and the work is easier when we trust the walkers beside us. What about speed? The net moves fast, but walking fast isn't the same as travelling far. A claim gains distance when it collects confirmations from different slopes and seasons, when it learns to endure new weather and new eyes. And the strange beauty of this shared trail is that, even as we invite more feet to join, the path becomes clearer rather than muddier, because each careful step compacts the soil in the same direction, until the route emerges from the bracken and is easy to follow even in low light, even when you're weary enough that your bootlaces feel like work. If Atlas stays quiet, your attention still matters. You're part of the long watch, the slow accumulation of nights that makes a baseline we can trust. If it brightens or shows a quirk, that baseline will be the map we compare against, the record that protects us from confusing one gust of wind with a change in the climate of the sky. Think of your notes as waypoints, small stones stacked at the edge of a bend, pointing gently onward. A last word for the road. When you look up and then look down to write, carry the same calm into your language that you felt in the looking. Small words travel better. Short sentences help others keep pace. If you feel a rush of hope, of fear, set it beside the facts rather than on top of them. A good path can hold both, the way a long trail holds both switchbacks and straightaways without losing its direction. I'm glad you're here, truly. The map is wide, and many hands make light work of carrying it. As we walk on, keep your stride easy, your notes neat, and your voice low. We will meet the next cairn together, and if your eyes grow heavy on the way, the path will keep itself until you wake. You can loosen your shoulders here, the mile markers are shared, and the way ahead is gentle. Listen first. The room holds a hush shaped by fans and faint electronics, a soft tide that rises in the vents and falls along the panels. Somewhere a coolant line hums, narrow as a whistle at the edge of hearing. Out beyond us, a telescope that sees heat as colour has been staring into very old light, and in that view a quiet bloom of red keeps returning. Astronomers started calling them little red dots, because that is how they appear at first glance, tiny, concentrated, and deeply red in the wavelengths that travel far from the earliest times. What are they? The honest answer is that they are compact sources whose light is shifted by distance and time, with colours that imply dust, youth, or both. Some sit where we expected nothing quite so bright or so small. They do not shout, they persist, like flecks of sunset trapped in long mist. The possibilities are mostly natural, and many are beautiful. A very young galaxy wrapped in dust can glow red as the haze warms and hides the hotter blue. A small galaxy with a ravenous central black hole can radiate in ways that turn its core into a tight ember. Star factories, crowded and fast, can brew chemical smoke that filters starlight into deeper tones. None of this demands the extraordinary. It asks us to widen the catalogue of strange normals the universe keeps. Part of the redness is the stretch of the universe itself. As space has grown, waves of light have grown with it. What left as something bluer arrives to us as something redder, and the colder eyes of our instruments are tuned to hear it. Detectors in the near to mid-infrared lay out fields sprinkled with these dense, ruddy points. Some show lines in their spectra that hint at hot gas. Some do not. In each case, the mist of our ignorance thins with every follow-up, then thickens again where the data are still spare. The lesson these dots teach is quiet and firm. The cosmos makes categories we didn't plan for, and it makes them often. As soon as our mirrors sharpen or our sensors cool, new kinds of weather appear in the deep. Red fogs where we expected clear air, faint shapes that only resolve when patience accumulates. It is a relief, really, to be reminded that surprise is a natural climate, not a verdict. The mist is thick with new names waiting to be found. Carry that relief back to our traveller. If a compact, unfamiliar glow can live respectably in the far past, then a nearby object with unusual chemistry or dust may live just as respectably in our present, without asking us to abandon natural paths. Uncommon does not mean unearthly. It means the fog is still lifting. And if a measurement hints at something that leans away from the expected curve, the right move is to bring more lanterns and stand in different places until edges appear where before there were only soft gradients of red. You can feel how this changes our posture. Instead of hunting a single spectacular cause, we let the small causes layer. Dust that sifts light, gas excited by shocks, clusters of young stars hiding inside their own smoke, and the long pour of distance that reddens everything it touches. Because when you list the mundane miracles one by one, and you test them against the data collected by different instruments under different skies, you find that the haze of uncertainty begins to behave like whether we have known. And whether we have known is whether we can stay calm within, even when it gathers in unfamiliar shapes and colours. The dots also remind us to separate brightness from bigness. Something can be intense without being large. The way a lamp glimpse through fog can seem to hover without dimensions until you step closer and see the post. Tiny can mean tightly fed, not titanic. In the same spirit, a spike in one measurement can be a local draft, rather than a global storm. We adjust our jackets, not our maps. Across a long night, patterns emerge. Some little red dots show signatures that match growing black holes. Others resemble compact star nurseries scorched by their own newborns. Still others may be blends of both, or something we haven't placed yet, because the mist is thickest exactly where the road bends. None of that is a problem. It is the work. And it counsels us gently to treat new anomalies near home with the same patience. Cross-check, re-observe, compare, breathe, until the outline stops shifting. Hold the sound of the room again. The hush is the same hush the great mirrors hear when they face a sky so faint it feels like weather made of almost nothing. In that almost nothing, the red blooms are small testaments to the way nature stacks the unexpected into ordinary piles. And because they do, we can let our shoulders settle when a nearby fog bank forms around a new visitor. The method that sorts distant mists will sort the local one too, and in the sorting, there is no need to raise the voice or quicken the steps. For a little while, let's keep only the soundscape. A low fan draws a steady breath. Somewhere metal answers with a soft, cooling tick. In the corners, cables make a hush like rain that can't decide whether to fall. The room exhale deepens and fades, and the night folds itself into a softer shape, while the quiet bloom of red keeps its place on the panel, content to wait with us in the mist. We take a slow walk along the pier of chemistry, listening to gentle water against wood. The harbour lights are low, and the night lays a steady swell beneath our steps. Out beyond the breakwater, waves carry faint signatures the way air carries scent. Up close, the planks creak like quiet instruments keeping time. The first buoy is made of ice. In many star-forming harbours, and even in neighbouring galaxies, cold grains carry simple molecules: water, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methanol. When a young star warms the key, those ices release their cargo, and the air of space grows aromatic with small, carbon-bearing guests. Telescopes tuned to the infrared read those vapours like tides on a chart. A second buoy is darker, more tar than crystal. Complex organics cling to dust, layered by radiation and time. Some are ring-shaped, some thread-like. Many are not life, but they are useful to life in the way salt is useful to an ocean, ubiquitous, shaping, patient. We've found these films and vapours in multiple coves of the sky. They tell us the pantry is stocked in more than one port. Walk a little farther and we reach a ladder down to the waterline, where biosignatures and technosignatures sometimes look like the same ripple. Oxygen, for instance, can rise from photosynthesizers in a sunlit shallows, or from rock split by light, or water unbalanced by chemistry on a young, bright shore. Methane can bubble from life in marshy flats, or from volcanism under cold seas, from rocks altered by heat, from industry if industry exists. The same glint, different hulls. So we don't trust a single glint. We trust a sea state. Pairs of gases can betray lives at work when they ride together beyond what geology can hold stable. Oxygen with methane in long, sustained amounts, for example, is harder to keep without something mending the mix. Other pairings, like carbon dioxide with carbon monoxide at odd ratios, might point to strange currents rather than living shoals. Each combination is a compass bearing, not a destination. Our traveller, like any passing craft, carries its own spray. If warming draws out carbon dioxide more than water, that may simply mean it was built in a colder shipyard, a cloud where those ices were common and water less so. If the dust scatters light in a way our instruments call unusual, that can be grain size and structure. Shell fragments in one stretch, smoother pebbles in another, not a new kind of captain on the deck. The sea offers variety long before it offers intent. But we keep deck logs anyway. The practice matters. We write down when a certain line brightens as the sun climbs, when another fades as phase angles change, when nothing holds from one watch to the next. We compare these notes with those from other peers, other crews, so that a rumour that began as a splash resolves into a pattern of waves crossed by many keels. Shared logs are how you navigate unfamiliar channels without running aground. On distant coasts, we've learned to pair caution with awe. A faint chemical trail across a planet's sky can make the heart lift like a sail. Yet the good habit is to check the wind before you raise it. Instruments have moods, and some harbours breed mirages. That's why we call again a month later, and again in a different season. And we ask a ship in another ocean to look from its own horizon. The sea is large, and it rewards patient triangulation. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase chemical disequilibrium, a mouthful that only means certain mixtures should settle, but don't. Life can be the hand that keeps them stirred. Yet, we've also learned that rocks and light can stir too. So the rule is simple and hard. Collect enough bearings to rule out the easy currents, then the tricky eddies, then the rare whirlpools, and only then consider that a crew might be aboard. It's a mariner's method. You do not signal every lantern you see. You first make sure it's not a reflection from your own glass. Notice how this posture slows the evening to a manageable tide. We're not forbidding messages, nor are we hunting mysteries with nets too fine. We are keeping to the channel that charts both risks, false alarms that make us miss the real thing, and real signals mistaken for weather. Between those lies the patient course, and on that course sleep is possible, because the helm is steady and the stars are allowed to be stars, without being drafted into stories they did not volunteer to tell. If you're still with me on the pier, let's watch one vignette drift by. A comet wakes as sunlight rises on its hull. Carbon dioxide breathes out first because its frost loosens before water's does. and a brief sheen appears like moonlight on a swell line. Nearby, dust grains spin and make the scattered light tilt in polarization, which our gauges read as a subtle shift in the water's colour. A few nights later, the sheen softens, the tilt eases, and the log shows tides matching the chart, rather than a signal from a vessel turning a lamp toward us. And across these small, ordinary changes runs the long, calming lesson that the ocean of space is full of familiar features we simply haven't sailed often enough to recognize at first sight, which is why we mark them carefully and then lower the pen. Where, then, would a techno-signature stand apart? Not with a single crest, but with a pattern, in timing, in direction, in energy, that refuses the wind and current we know. A pulse that keeps appointment across nights. A warmth that modulates with a schedule no season explains. A line in a spectrum that walks away from chemistry's limits as if on a pier built to plan. Even then, we'd expect more than one watch, more than one ship, more than one ocean to confirm. And where would a biosignature earn our slow nod? In a mixture that does not sleep. In gases that should settle but don't. Measured in the same way by instruments with different quirks, under suns of different temperaments. In a trail that returns with the tide and refuses to be weathered down by new calibrations. That's how a harbour moves from rumour to port of call. We will keep this cadence with Atlas. Observe, compare, speak simply, and let both life's ingredients and technology's echoes be possibilities that live just offshore, neither invited onto the deck too early, nor waved away, because the chart is old. The sea teaches us to trust both the map and the sky, and to leave a light at the harbour mouth for whatever comes honestly down the channel. Stand with me at that mouth for a breath. The swell rises, then rests. The horizon is a quiet hinge between dark and darker, and the tide makes a low argument with the stones. We don't need to decide tonight. We only need to keep the lantern trimmed and the log neat, and pause at the line where piers end and open water begins. The postcard sits on the table like a swatch, paper with a crease and a neat ink note in the margin. A late summer night at a quiet radio dish. A narrow tone passes once, is circled in red by a hand that refuses exclamation, then filed with care into the drawer where threads that never returned sleep beside the ones that did. The fabric of listening learned something that night. Even a bright strand is only a strand until the loom catches it again. Another postcard, a star whose light thinned in irregular measures. Some years ago, as if the cloth between us and it had gathered puckers and folds, spectra were checked, seams were pressed, models were basted together and pulled apart. With more colours and more nights, fine dust explained the dimming better than grand constructions, the way a light linen can look shadowed when a gauze passes over it, and yet the linen itself remains sound. The lesson held, add layers, then decide. A third swatch, an autumn claim from very near home, a trace molecule in a cloud deck where our instruments do not often promise easy answers. The first panel was strong, the next panels were patient. Calibrations were recut, band passes re-hemmed, and the seam allowance of error widened and narrowed by many hands until the piece lay flat enough to judge on its true grain. The habit, again, was to sew slowly. I keep these postcards within reach when the room grows eager. They remind me that the sky answers best to commas, not to exclamations. A comma lets the sentence of a signal breathe, It invites another clause, another night, another instrument, another team, before we set a period. The weave prefers that punctuation. It keeps the selvage straight. In that spirit, we can add 2 more pieces to the book. One is a long, thin remnant from a visitor whose brightness rose and fell in ways that pulled conjectures tight. With time, the stitches eased into more ordinary cloth, a traveller that left questions at the edge, but no tear through the middle. The other is a sturdier patch from a later passerby, woven like a textbook comet, its warp and weft so regular that it became our control fabric for interstellar thread. Together, they taught us to compare textures before we rename the cloth. Midway through the watch, let the room take a breath. Then return to the desk where the shuttle clicks from side to side and write what the postcards ask us to write. First, repeatability is the only way a colour becomes a dye and not a stain. Second, cross-weaving, radio with optics, chemistry with polarization, one observatory with another, turns a single strand into a cloth that can hold weight. Third, claims wear better when cut on small, true words that can be tested by anyone with the pattern. There is also the quiet kindness of admitting when the fabric slips. A false start is just a foot caught in the hem. You free it and continue. A misread thread count is corrected by counting again, this time with a brighter lamp or a slower hand. None of this is failure. It is tailoring. The garment must fit not just one excited wearer on one bright night, but a whole crowd of shoulders on an ordinary morning. Bring that patience to our current piece. The object we've been following will pass through its best light window around the time calendar's turn to cooler months. When it does, more threads will be available to tug. We will ask the same old questions in the same plain order. Does a narrowband tone hold when the receiver's gain shifts? Does a pulse appear at 2 looms at once? Does warmth modulate on a schedule that ignores the season? Do spectral lines walk outside the limits chemistry allows? And in every case, do the stitches look the same when sewn by strangers who keep different clocks and different notebooks, yet share the same care for straight seams and true edges? Because that shared care is how a new panel earns its place in the quilt, rather than fraying the whole at the margin. A long sentence belongs here, one that moves like a shuttle across the warp, steady even, and a touch hypnotic, saying that certainty in this room is not woven from a single brilliant filament, but from the patient crossing of many modest threads, each checked, each tightened, each trimmed where it snags, until the surface is smooth enough for your sleeping hand to rest on without catching, and smooth enough for the waking mind to slide across tomorrow without finding a hidden knot. When we look back at the older swatches, we don't scold them for not becoming coats. We thank them for teaching us how to stitch the next panel. The radio note that did not return trained our ears to accept absence without inventing a pattern. The dim star taught us to iron models until they lay flat under dust. The nearby chemistry debate taught us that a hem can be let out or taken in as measurements improve, and that the garment wears better after the alterations than it did before. If Atlas offers an odd thread, the drawer is ready. We will pin it beside the others, label it with clean handwriting, and ask it to return under gentler light. If it does, we weave. If it doesn't, we don't force the shuttle through. We leave room for sleep and for science to share the same bench without bumping elbows. The cloth survives many nights because we refuse to pull too hard on a strand that isn't anchored. You can rest inside this method. It is domestic rather than dramatic, and that is why it holds. The patient weave outlives the fast cut. The hem sewn in small, even bites outlasts the sweeping gesture. The simple, tested seam supports more weight than the ornament that hides a weak joint. When in doubt, we choose the craft that makes tomorrow's wearing easier for everyone who must live inside the same garment of truth. So we mark tonight's line in the log, loom start, shuttle count, stitch length, and set the needle down where the cloth remembers the last pass, ready for the next hand to pick it up and add 2 quiet rows, the calendar edge nearing, the window opening, the pattern steadying. Night holds steady in the lab. The rack lights are small constellations, the monitors low, and between them the room keeps time with a steady tick. Fans breathe a soft chord under everything. On the bench, a clipboard waits, checklists printed in square, quiet type. We move down the lines without hurry. Record start times, verify clock sync, confirm station IDs, note weather. The tick goes on, even when our pens pause. Backups first. Raw frames spool to local storage. Mirrors catch them across the network. A third copy lands in cold space where fingers rarely touch. Logs pair each file with a checksum, every checksum with a time. Processed sets live beside their parents, not instead of them, so another team can replay our night from the first echo to the last. It isn't drama, it's habit, like keeping a metronome on the desk so an ensemble never argues about tempo when the passage gets intricate and fatigue wants to rush the line. The call tree is printed, folded, and taped to the inside of the cabinet door. If a candidate persists across instruments and nights, the first ring is within the scientific circle, senior observers, the post-detection working group, archivists. Then the wider room, people who speak for the project, people who set data public, people who write clearly in many languages. If the candidate crosses thresholds into reply territory, the path extends outward. The academy that curates these practices, the UN forum where space questions are stitched by consensus, the spectrum managers who keep radio lanes from tangling. Nobody owns the sound. They share the score so the orchestra stays in tune. Decision forks sit on a whiteboard like a clean rhythm tree. Natural, unknown, technological. Each branch asks for a repeat performance. Does the signal persist when the receiver changes gain? Does it travel with the object's motion and not with our own electronics? Does light echo the tone in another band, optical with radio, heat with line emission? If the pattern weakens under these knocks, it drops to the low shelf labeled archive and study later. If it strengthens, it rises a step and gathers more time, more ears, more rooms. Another sheet holds language. What we say, when we say it, and how we say it matters. The simplest phrasing survives the most hands. We prefer nouns over adjectives, tone, pulse, line, drift. We state instruments and settings, leave doors open where uncertainty remains, and publish the sounds once our peers have had their listen. The pause between hearing and speaking isn't silence. It's the room aligning its clocks, so nothing we release comes out of time with the rest. There's a risk ledger too, scored like a soft drum under the melody. One column tracks false positives, the bright taps that don't return. Another tracks overconfident claims that become noise in public halls. A third marks the risk of waiting too long when a real pattern asks for care. The guidance we've carried all night helps balance them. Share promptly with peers, archive openly, confirm independently. And if the pattern ever crosses from listening to talking, consult before replying. So the first note from our side lands where it should, on the beat and in key. You can hear how this is music rather than command, a score whose movements are acquire, verify, archive, share, consult, decide, each movement with its own instruments and rests, each cue designed so a change of soloist doesn't break the tempo, and a listener who drifts to sleep beside the score learns by osmosis that certainty is not a cymbal crash, but a chord, built slowly, voice by voice, until even the cautious ear admits the harmony is there, and admits it not because someone shouted, but because the same intervals arrived from different corners of the hall under different hands and still aligned, softly, exactly, again and again. If the fork lands on natural, the work folds into papers and maps, parameters tightened, catalogues updated. If the fork stays on unknown, the metronome remains on, and we keep listening with modest claims and generous data. If the fork leans toward technological, the room gets larger without getting louder. Technical leads, legal stewards, language keepers, and radio guardians lay the score on one table and run a finger down the bar lines together. In each path, the tick continues. You breathe with it, slower than speech. Your part is still welcome here. Calm attention helps the room hold its pitch. The habit of small, true words helps us resist crescendos that instruments don't support. Notes taken and posted, with time and method intact, become a chorus of soft confirmations that make rash solos unnecessary. You can feel how this takes the weight off the shoulders and places it on the rhythm, where it belongs. The lab dimmer lowers another notch. I write one last timestamp, close the log, and let the rack fans fill the pauses between the ticks. The decision architecture isn't a wall, it's a score stand, holding what we'll need when the next passage asks for both care and courage. We do not rush the downbeat, we let the room count us in. At 02:14, the room remembers how to breathe. We've kept a long, even watch together. A visitor from elsewhere drew a faint line across our sky, and we followed without hurry, naming what we know, holding lightly what we don't. We rested on 3 handrails, the date of first notice, the open curve of its path, and the brief window when sunlight lends our instruments a little more voice. We let dust and light explain themselves in their own slow grammar. Tails and anti-tails, phase angles and subtle polarization. Signals that say more in stacks than in single frames. We listened across lanes, radio for narrow tones, optics for quick flashes, warmth for modest glows, and we gave patience room to work. When questions turned toward speaking, we traced the quiet channels that have existed for years. Verification first, archiving open, then consultation where many hands can keep the seam straight before anyone answers for all. No alarms, only careful breath between clauses so the sentence lands true. If sleep found you somewhere along this path, the method kept walking. Notes were taken, clocks stayed in step, and the sky went on with its soft labor of being strange in ways that are usually natural. Should the pattern ever lean toward extraordinary, you know the posture will take. Small words, shared data, more ears, slower claims. If it leans back toward ordinary, that is a kind answer too. Both leave the night a gentler place. Thank you for keeping company in this pace. Let your shoulders drop a little more. The relay tick is content to keep time without you, and the light at the window will thin toward morning in its own way. May your rest be easy, and your dreams quiet as the long instruments of the dark. Good night,